When reports surface that the Pentagon is preparing thousands of troops for possible domestic deployment, I don't hear them as abstract signals from Washington. I hear them as warnings, not alarms in the cinematic sense, but the quieter, more dangerous kind indicators that the ordinary machinery of American governance is grinding against stress. It was never designed to absorb smoothly. A standby order is not an action. It is a posture. And postures tell you how power is thinking before it moves. The preparation of federal troops for potential deployment to Minnesota did not emerge in a vacuum. It followed weeks of escalating civic unrest, sharpened rhetoric, and an erosion of trust between citizens and institutions meant to serve them. From my seat as a governor, I recognize a pattern immediately. When federal authorities begin to consider active duty forces for domestic contingencies, it usually means civilian tools are being judged insufficient, politically compromised, or too slow for the moment at hand. The reality is that America has always struggled with the boundary between civil order and military power. We prefer to believe that line is bright and permanent. It isn't. It is conditional, historical, and shaped by fear as much as by law. Preparatory orders like this exist precisely because the federal government retains extraordinary authority in moments of perceived instability. The question is never whether the power exists. The question is why leaders feel compelled to place their hands on it. There is a misjudgment that often follows these moments. Leaders convince themselves that readiness alone will deter escalation, that the mere knowledge of federal force standing by will restore calm. In practice, it often does the opposite. It signals that dialogue is narrowed, that political imagination has contracted, and that the state is beginning to think in terms of control rather than consent. The consequence is not immediate violence. It is something more corrosive, the normalization of military logic in civic life. Once that threshold is approached, every disagreement begins to feel existential. Every protest, a security threat. Every governor, a potential obstacle rather than a partner. The lesson learned repeatedly and too often too late is that stability in a democracy is not maintained by how quickly troops can be mobilized, but by how resilient institutions remain before anyone believes they must be. When the conversation turns to the Insurrection Act, it is usually because something has already gone wrong. Presidents do not reach for 19th century emergency statutes in moments of confidence. They reach for them when they believe legitimacy alone will no longer carry the weight of command. I have studied this law not as a constitutional curiosity, but as a contingency, one that sits quietly in the background of American governance, waiting for stress to expose it. The Insurrection Act grants the president sweeping authority to deploy federal troops inside the United States, bypassing the usual restrictions that separate military force from civilian law enforcement. It was written for a young republic facing rebellion, not for a modern democracy navigating protest, polarization, and media saturation. Yet it remains intact, largely unchanged, precisely because Congress has never fully agreed on how much discretion presidents should surrender in moments of crisis. The reality is that the act is legal. That fact is often used to end the discussion. But legality is not the same as wisdom. The law's broad language allows a president to determine, largely on their own, when state authorities are unwilling or unable to protect constitutional rights. That judgment call collapses legal analysis into political instinct. And instinct, in times of unrest, is rarely neutral. The misjudgment comes when presidential authority is treated as a substitute for political resolution. Invoking or even threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act can feel decisive. It projects strength. It reassures some audiences, but it also reframes civic conflict as insurrection, dissent as disorder, and governors as secondary actors in their own states. Once that frame is adopted, compromise becomes weakness and restraint becomes delay. The consequences ripple outward, federal-state relations harden, courts are pulled into a reactive posture, National Guard forces, traditionally accountable to governors, become symbols in a larger struggle over command. Most damaging of all, citizens begin to internalize the idea that political disagreement is something to be managed by force rather than mediated through institutions. The lesson here is not that presidential authority should be eliminated. It is that extraordinary power, left vague and unchecked, that invites extraordinary misuse. A democracy survives not because its leaders can impose order, but because they know that when order is imposed, it will cost more than it restores. Unrest does not arrive fully formed. It accumulates, it builds quietly through policy decisions, enforcement choices, and moments when communities conclude rightly or wrongly that the system is no longer listening. By the time federal officials begin discussing troop readiness, the causes are already months, sometimes years, in the making. What unfolds on the streets is only the visible expression of deeper institutional strain. In Minnesota, as in many parts of the country, the immediate triggers were specific and identifiable. Aggressive federal enforcement actions, disputed uses of force, and a rapid escalation of confrontation between authorities and civilians. These events mattered not only for what happened, but for how they were perceived. In an environment saturated with live video, fragmented media, and national political narratives, local incidents are quickly absorbed into larger ideological battles. Context collapses, nuance disappears, each side speaks past the other, convinced that escalation is being forced upon them. The federal response followed a familiar logic. When unrest is framed as a failure of local control, Washington steps forward as guarantor of order. Statements emphasize security, protection of property, and restoration of calm. What is often lost is the distinction between enforcing the law and resolving conflict. Federal agencies are designed for the former, they are structurally ill-suited for the latter. The misjudgment occurs when enforcement is treated as communication. Raids become messages. Deployments become signals. Officials assume that firmness will deter further unrest, overlooking how force can validate the very grievances it seeks to suppress. Communities already skeptical of federal intent interpret escalation as confirmation that power is indifferent to their concerns. The consequences are cumulative. Protests widen rather than narrow. Moderate voices retreat. Local leaders find their room to maneuver shrinking as federal presence hardens positions on all sides. What might have been addressed through negotiation and policy adjustment becomes a standoff shaped by symbolism and resolve. The lesson is uncomfortable but consistent. Federal authority can impose order temporarily, but it cannot manufacture legitimacy. When unrest is met primarily with force, the underlying causes do not vanish. They wait, and the longer they wait, the more likely they are to return in forms that demand even harsher responses, locking the system into a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. As a governor, I am acutely aware of how narrow this space becomes when federal power begins to press down on state authority. The Constitution speaks confidently about federalism, but in practice, it is a negotiation conducted under pressure, shaped less by theory than by leverage. When unrest escalates, and Washington signals its readiness to intervene, governors are forced into a posture that is neither fully autonomous nor entirely subordinate. State leaders are expected to maintain order, protect civil liberties, and preserve public trust simultaneously. Those expectations often collide. In moments like this, resistance to federal intervention is rarely absolute. It is procedural, legalistic, and cautious by necessity. Governors assert jurisdiction over National Guard forces, emphasize existing law enforcement capacity, and signal willingness to cooperate while quietly working to prevent the situation from being redefined as a federal emergency. The reality is that state authority has limits that are not always visible to the public. Once federal officials frame unrest as a threat to constitutional order, the burden shifts. Governors must prove competence under scrutiny, often in real time and under hostile national media conditions. Every misstep becomes evidence that local control has failed. Every delay is recast as defiance. The misjudgment some leaders make is believing that rhetorical opposition alone can preserve state autonomy. Statements defending the local authority may satisfy constituents, but they do little to alter the federal calculus if conditions continue to deteriorate. Resistance without de-escalation risks accelerating the very intervention it seeks to avoid. The consequences are isolating, State leaders find themselves squeezed between federal pressure above and public anger below. National Guard deployments become politically charged symbols rather than neutral tools. Coordination gives way to suspicion, and cooperation becomes transactional rather than strategic. The lesson is sobering. Federalism functions best not as a battlefield, but as a buffer. When that buffer erodes, states are left with fewer meaningful choices. Authority becomes reactive instead of proactive, and leadership shifts from shaping outcomes to containing damage. In those moments, the true challenge is not asserting power, but preserving legitimacy long enough to keep power from being taken out of your hands altogether. By the time federal authorities begin discussing troop readiness in public, the operational decision has already been paired with a political one. Deployments are never just about logistics. They are about narrative. I have learned that in moments of national tension, the federal government does not simply act, it performs. Every statement, every leak, every carefully chosen phrase is meant to signal resolve to some audiences and warning to others. The strategy is rarely articulated openly, but it is easy to trace. Federal leaders frame readiness as prudence, restraint as conditional, and escalation as reluctant but inevitable. The language emphasizes protection of property, of federal personnel, of constitutional order, while leaving ambiguous who precisely is being protected from whom. That ambiguity is not accidental. It allows supporters to project strength onto the action, while critics are left arguing against a posture that has not yet fully materialized. The misjudgment comes when signaling is mistaken for governance. Preparing troops can be politically useful even if they are never deployed. It reassures a base that demands firmness. It pressures state officials to fall in line. It shifts the media conversation from underlying grievances to questions of authority and control. But signaling has costs. Once the federal government adopts the language of force, it narrows its own exit ramps. De-escalation begins to look like retreat. The consequences unfold subtly. Protest movements adapt, hardening their rhetoric in response to perceived threats. State leaders become more guarded, less willing to share information candidly. Federal agencies start coordinating around worst-case scenarios rather than best-case outcomes. What began as contingency planning becomes a self-reinforcing cycle of anticipation and distrust. The deeper lesson is that political signaling is not neutral. It shapes reality. When leaders emphasize domination over dialogue, they train institutions to respond accordingly. Over time, the state becomes more comfortable projecting power than exercising patience. That shift does not announce itself dramatically. It settles in quietly, normalizing the idea that public dissent is something to be managed from above rather than engaged with across the table. Governance demands more than strength. It demands judgment about when strength should remain visible and when it should deliberately step back. The most fragile line in a constitutional democracy is not written in statute. It is cultural. It is the shared understanding that the military exists to defend the nation from external threats, not to arbitrate internal political conflict. When that line begins to blur, even without a single soldier stepping into the streets, the strain on the system becomes visible. Civil-military boundaries in the United States have always depended less on enforcement than on restraint. Laws like posse comitatus express intent, but they rely on leaders choosing not to test their outer limits. Preparing active duty troops for domestic deployment pushes directly against that tradition. It invites the military into spaces where legitimacy is contested and outcomes are inherently political. The reality is that the armed forces are not designed for ambiguity of this kind. Soldiers are trained to execute orders, not to interpret protest movements or mediate civic grievances. When placed on standby for internal missions, they become instruments of political decision-making, whether they want to or not. That places an unfair burden on the institution and risks drawing it into disputes that cannot be resolved through discipline or command. The misjudgment is assuming that professionalism alone insulates the military from politicization. Even the act of preparation sends a message about who is trusted with authority and who is not. Over time, repeated exposure to domestic contingencies reshapes expectations both within the ranks and among civilians about when military involvement is appropriate. The consequences extend beyond any single deployment. Courts are forced to grapple with cases they were never meant to resolve quickly. Norms that once seemed fixed become negotiable. Future leaders inherit a precedent that makes extraordinary measures easier to justify and harder to resist. What was once unthinkable becomes merely controversial, then routine. The lesson is clear and uncomfortable. Constitutional systems erode not only through violation but through normalization. Each time the civil-military boundary is tested and survives, it emerges slightly thinner. Preserving it requires leaders who understand that the strength of a democracy is measured not by how often it can deploy force at home, but by how rarely it feels compelled to consider doing so. The aftermath of a moment like this is rarely marked by a single decisive outcome. Whether troops ultimately deploy or remain on standby, the country does not simply reset. What lingers is memory, how close institutions came to crossing lines they insist still matter. The real reckoning begins after the headlines fade, when leaders and citizens alike must confront what was revealed about the system under stress. In the short term, tension often recedes through exhaustion rather than resolution. Protests diminish, enforcement actions slow, and officials declare stability restored. But stability achieved without trust is fragile. Communities remember the readiness of force more vividly than the promises of restraint. Governors remember how quickly authority can be challenged from above. Federal officials remember how effective the threat of intervention can be in reshaping behavior. The misjudgment at this stage is assuming that restraint erases precedent. It does not. Each episode becomes part of the institutional memory that future leaders will draw upon. The next crisis will reference this one implicitly, if not explicitly, lowering the threshold for similar measures. What was once extraordinary becomes an available option, debated but no longer unthinkable. The consequences are generational. Young Americans absorb these moments as lessons about how power responds to dissent. Civil servants internalize new assumptions about escalation and compliance. The military, having been placed near the center of domestic political tension, carries that experience forward, however professionally it was handled. The national reckoning, if it comes at all, is uneven. Some will argue that order was preserved and catastrophe avoided. Others will point to the costs in legitimacy and democratic confidence. Both can be true. The challenge is whether the country is capable of learning from the tension rather than merely surviving it. The lesson I draw is not that the system failed, but that it revealed its vulnerabilities. Democracies do not collapse in moments of crisis. They weaken in the intervals between them when extraordinary measures are quietly absorbed into the normal toolkit of governance. The task of leadership is to resist that drift, to remember that power, once normalized, is rarely surrendered, and that restraint, unlike force, must be chosen each time. This concludes the 7-part analysis.